The Life and Crimes of Gaston Means, America's Greatest Conman. Act 1, The Making of a Rogue, expanded narration, 4,000 plus words. In the early 1900s, America was a land of opportunity, at Chapel Hill, but academia held no interest for him. Why study when charm and cunning could get him ahead faster? He dropped out before earning a degree, opting instead to forge his own path. At first, this path led him to a respectable job as a traveling salesman for a cotton mill. But even in a legitimate a persuasive charm, and an uncanny ability to fabricate elaborate stories, he could weave a web so intricate that even those who suspected him found themselves ensnared. He became a master storyteller, a performer whose audience was the wealthy and the desperate alike. But the real turning point in his career came not from his extortion, his career would be a masterclass in manipulation. But no con would be as bold, as audacious, as the one that would define his legacy, the swindle that played upon the grief of a nation, in the wake of the Lindbergh baby's kidnapping. Act 2, From Private Detective to Spy, expanded narration, 4,000 plus words. By 1911, Gaston Means had already mastered the art of deception. He had conned his way through life, climbing the ranks of society not through hard work, but through manipulation and fraud. But his ambitions were far from over. He was about to step into an even more dangerous world, one where deception wasn't just a skill, it was a profession. And where the stakes weren't just money, but secrets that could shift the balance of power. When Means joined the William J. Burns International Detective Agency, he saw an opportunity to turn his talent for lies into something even more lucrative. Burns' agency was no ordinary detective firm. It specialized in high-stakes investigations for the wealthy and powerful, often blurring the lines between legal and illegal. The agency took on cases that police departments wouldn't touch, using whatever means necessary to get results. For Means, this was the perfect playground. From the start, he proved himself to be more than just another investigator. He was fearless, willing to do whatever it took to close a case, whether that meant bribing witnesses, eavesdropping on confidential conversations, or even breaking into offices to steal incriminating evidence. His ability to charm the rich while navigating the criminal underworld made him an invaluable asset. He could shake hands with politicians in the morning and sit down with gangsters by night, all while feeding information to the highest bidder. But while Means excelled in undercover work, there was one thing he lacked: a moral compass. The cases he took weren't about justice, they were about power and control. If a client needed dirt on a business rival, Means would fabricate it. If a political figure needed an opponent ruined, Means would make sure that opponent was destroyed. For him, the detective business wasn't about solving crimes, it was about creating them. His talents caught the eye of William Burns, a man as morally flexible as Means himself. Burns had built his detective empire on bending the law, often working for the very people he was supposed to investigate. He saw in Means a kindred spirit, someone who didn't just follow orders, but someone who understood that power belonged to those who could control the truth. Under Burns' mentorship, Means' skills sharpened, his deceptions became more intricate, and his thirst for power only grew. But even the most ambitious conmen have limits. And for Means, the world of private investigation was just a stepping stone. His true calling would come in the form of espionage. As World War I erupted in Europe, tensions ran high in America. The country had not yet entered the war, but intelligence operations were already in full swing. Spies lurked in the shadows, gathering secrets for their respective nations, and for those willing to betray their country, there were fortunes to be made. Means saw an opportunity, one that was too lucrative to ignore. He was approached by German operatives looking for inside information on American trade and supply routes. The Germans needed someone who could move undetected, someone who could pass along sensitive details without drawing attention. Means was more than willing to take on the role. He became known as Agent E13, a double agent working against his own country for the highest bidder. His assignments were as thrilling as they were treacherous. Means didn't just gather information, he actively helped the German war effort. He tracked cargo shipments, ensuring that supplies bound for the Allies were either delayed or intercepted. He arranged for essential war materials, like rubber and copper, to be smuggled into Germany. And perhaps most audaciously, he even founded the pro-German American Peace Society, a front organization designed to spread anti-war propaganda and influence political leaders into keeping the US out of the conflict. But what truly made Means' spy work extraordinary was the way he was paid. Unlike most agents who received their money through offshore accounts or discreet handoffs, Means' payments were delivered in a manner straight out of a spy novel. The money was dropped off at gravestones in the historic Trinity Church Cemetery in New York City. At night, under the cover of darkness, he would collect the payments, ensuring that no paper trail could link him to his German employers. It was a system as clever as it was risky. For Means, the thrill of espionage was intoxicating. He was no longer just a detective or a con artist, he was playing a part in global affairs, influencing the war from the shadows. The excitement of working as a double agent, of outsmarting governments and military officials, gave him a rush unlike anything he had ever experienced. And, of course, it was immensely profitable. But for all his cunning, Means made one critical mistake: he believed himself untouchable. As the war raged on, American intelligence agencies began cracking down on suspected spies. German operatives were being arrested, their networks dismantled. Means knew that the walls were closing in. And like the opportunist he was, he made a swift decision: he would switch sides before he got caught. In 1917, the United States entered World War I. Means saw the writing on the wall and immediately cut ties with his German handlers. He repositioned himself, now posing as a patriot, offering his services to American intelligence agencies. He painted himself as a former loyal investigator who had infiltrated German spy rings, spinning a tale of bravery and deception. He claimed he had been gathering intelligence for the US government all along, and now, with America entering the war, he was willing to serve his country once more. And incredibly, it worked. Instead of facing prosecution for espionage, Means found himself welcomed by those he had just betrayed. He had managed to pull off the ultimate deception, turning from traitor to patriot in a matter of months. His double dealing had paid off yet again. But even as he walked away unscathed, Means knew one thing: there was always a bigger game to play. The world of espionage had given him a taste of something greater than just money. It had given him power. He had manipulated governments, evaded capture, and turned war into a personal business venture. And now, with his newfound reputation as a trusted investigator, he was ready for the next chapter in his life. A chapter that would take him straight to Washington, D.C., where he would find himself entangled in one of the most corrupt political scandals in American history. Act 3, Murder, Scandal, and Political Corruption, expanded narration, 4,000 plus words. By the end of World War I, Gaston Means had already woven an intricate web of deception that spanned from private investigations to espionage. But while most men would have been satisfied with escaping the war unscathed, Means was not most men. For him, the real opportunities were just beginning. War had created instability, and instability meant opportunity for those who were bold enough to seize it. After leaving the world of espionage, Means set his sights on a new target, Maud King, a wealthy widow from Chicago. With a fortune inherited from her late husband, King was exactly the kind of mark he specialized in. She was wealthy, trusting, and completely unaware of the dangers lurking beneath Means' charm. Means posed as her financial advisor, promising to protect her assets, grow her investments, and secure her future. But in reality, he was doing none of those things. Instead, he systematically drained her accounts, funneling over $100,000 into his own pockets, a staggering sum for the time. He played the role of the concerned confidant, assuring her that every investment was sound, every risk calculated. And for a while, she believed him. But as the months passed, King began to notice inconsistencies. Her money was disappearing, and Means' explanations were growing thinner by the day. Sensing her growing suspicion, Means knew he had to act fast. If King exposed him, his entire operation could come crashing down. He needed a plan, one that would permanently eliminate the problem. And so, he invited her on a trip to his family's North Carolina plantation, a place isolated from prying eyes, far from the reach of law enforcement. It was the perfect setting for what was about to unfold. The details of what happened next remain shrouded in mystery. What is known is this: one evening, as Means and King took a stroll through the woods, a gunshot rang out. When the dust settled, King lay dead, shot in the head. Means' version of events? He claimed that she had been playing with his revolver, laughing and joking, when suddenly, the gun discharged by accident. It was a tragic mishap, he insisted. A freak accident. But there were problems with his story. Big problems. For starters, why had Means brought a loaded revolver on a peaceful walk with an unsuspecting widow? And how could she have fired the gun if she had never handled firearms before? Witnesses later reported that Means had grown increasingly nervous in the days leading up to King's death, making cryptic comments about things being handled soon. Even more damning? Just weeks before her death, Means had begun forging documents that named him as the primary beneficiary of her estate. Yet, despite these glaring red flags, Means walked free. The case went to trial, but the jury collection of his North Carolina peers acquitted him in record time. Later, it was revealed that 2 jurors had been bribed, and a third had been threatened into voting not guilty. The justice system had been played like a fiddle. Gaston Means had committed the perfect crime and gotten away with it. But Means wasn't done yet. He had bigger plans that would take him to the heart of American power, Washington, D.C. By the early 1920s, the political landscape was ripe for corruption. The Harding administration was one of the most scandal-ridden in American history, plagued by backdoor deals, bribery, and unchecked greed. And at the center of this political cesspool was Attorney General Harry Doherty, a man who believed that laws were made to be bent or broken entirely. Doherty saw in Means something familiar: a man without conscience, a man who could get things done by any means necessary. In 1921, he brought Means to Washington as a special investigator, a polite way of saying fixer. His real job? To act as the administration's bagman, funneling bribes from bootleggers, corporate tycoons, and war profiteers straight into the pockets of those in power. Under the guise of enforcing the law, Means did the exact opposite. He protected criminals instead of prosecuting them, selling political favors to the highest bidder. Want to avoid prosecution for illegal alcohol sales? pay Means. Need a pardon for a federal crime. Means could arrange that for a price. He operated as an unofficial broker of corruption, trading influence like a Wall Street stock. The money poured in, and Means lived lavishly, buying mansions, chauffeur-driven cars, and all the luxuries of high society. But his most lucrative scam involved prohibition. While the federal government cracked down on illegal alcohol, Means was quietly ensuring that the right people could buy access to government stockpiles of liquor. He made fortunes selling protection to bootleggers, promising immunity from prosecution in exchange for hefty payments. Of course, once the money was handed over, Means rarely followed through on his promises. Many bootleggers found themselves arrested anyway, but by then, their money was long gone. And who could they complain to? After all, they had paid a government official to break the law. It was a golden age of corruption, and Means thrived in it. But in Washington, loyalty was as fleeting as power itself. And when things started falling apart, Means would find himself on the wrong side of history. By 1923, the Harding administration was unraveling. Scandals like Teapot Dome, where government oil reserves were secretly leased to private companies in exchange for bribes, had shaken public confidence. The walls were closing in, and politicians were looking for someone to take the fall. Doherty, once untouchable, was now under scrutiny. And when the investigation started, Means did what he did best: he flipped. He turned on his former allies, testifying before Senate committees about the corruption he had witnessed. But there was a problem: Means was a pathological liar. Even when telling the truth, he couldn't resist embellishing, twisting facts to suit his own narrative. His testimony was a mixture of fact and fiction, making it impossible to separate reality from fabrication. While some of his allegations were later proven true, many were wild exaggerations or outright fabrications. In the end, his testimony did more harm than good, not for the corrupt politicians, but for Means himself. Instead of being hailed as a whistleblower, he was seen as a man with no credibility, no honor, and no loyalty. His former associates abandoned him, and the very system he had exploited for years now turned against him. The conman had finally conned himself. By 1925, Means was no longer untouchable. He was convicted on charges of bribery and fraud, sentenced to over 3 years in federal prison. But even behind bars, he was already scheming his next move. Because if there was one thing Gaston Means knew better than anyone, it was that a well-told lie was often more powerful than the truth. And his next lie? It would be his biggest one yet. Act 4, The Lindbergh Kidnapping Swindle, expanded narration, 4,000 plus words. By the early 1930s, Gaston Means had built a lifetime of lies, fraud, and political corruption. He had stolen from the wealthy, manipulated the legal system, and sold political favors like cheap commodities. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could compare to the scheme he was about to pull off. A deception so audacious, so heartless, that it would make him infamous for generations to come. The crime? Exploiting the most heartbreaking tragedy in America's history, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. It was March 1, 1932. The entire nation was gripped with shock and horror. Charles Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old son of famed aviator Charles Lindbergh, had been kidnapped from his nursery. The crime was unimaginable. The Lindbergh family was beloved, their story a symbol of American excellence and adventure. And now, their young child was missing. The case would soon be called the crime of the century. And as the nation mourned and law enforcement scrambled to track down the kidnappers, Gaston Means saw opportunity. You see, while others saw the tragedy for what it was, a devastating blow to a family and a country, Means saw a way to make money. He had no interest in justice, no concern for the Lindbergh family's suffering. What he saw was an opening, a stage on which he could run one of the most elaborate scams in American history. To pull it off, he needed a mark, someone desperate enough to believe anything, rich enough to pay him, and trusting enough to let him operate without suspicion. Enter Evelyn Walsh McLean, a wealthy socialite and heiress. She was one of the richest women in America, having inherited a massive fortune from her father's mining empire. Her extravagant lifestyle and expensive taste were legendary. She was also the owner of the infamous Hope Diamond, a stone rumored to bring tragedy to all who possessed it. Now, it seemed, that curse had found her. Evelyn was a close friend of the Lindberghs and was desperate to help. She was willing to do anything to ensure the safe return of baby Charles. And that was exactly what Means needed. So, with his usual smooth charm, Means approached Evelyn with a shocking revelation. He claimed that he knew who had taken the child. He told her that he had connections to the criminal underworld, that a former cellmate of his had been approached about the kidnapping plan before it even happened. But Means, of course, had refused to participate because, he said, even he had limits. Now, though, he could use his knowledge to help. He could negotiate with the kidnappers, arrange for the ransom to be delivered, and bring baby Charles home safely. It was a convincing act, and Evelyn believed every word. She wanted nothing more than to be the hero who saved the Lindbergh baby. She asked him what needed to be done. Means had his trap set. He told her that the kidnappers were demanding $100,000 a fortune at the time, worth more than $2 million in today's money. And, of course, Means would need another $4,000 for his own expenses. Evelyn did exactly as she was told. She withdrew the money from her bank, ensuring that it was in old $50 and $100 bills, as per Means' instructions. She kept the whole thing a secret, not even telling her lawyers or closest friends. And then, with absolute trust in Means, she handed him the cash. But what did Means do? Did he contact the kidnappers? Did he work to secure the child's release? Of course not. The moment the money was in his hands, he had already won. With the ransom safely tucked away, Means began his act. He knew he couldn't just vanish immediately, it would be too suspicious. He needed to keep Evelyn on the hook long enough to make his escape. So he staged an elaborate series of fake negotiations. First, he told her that the kidnappers were being careful and that things would take time. Then, he began sending her on a wild goose chase. He claimed the child had been moved to South Carolina and arranged for Evelyn to travel there. But when she arrived, there was no baby. No kidnappers. Nothing. Means made up an excuse there had been a slip-up, and the baby had been moved again. This time, to Mexico. Evelyn, still believing she was on the verge of saving the Lindbergh baby, followed every instruction. She boarded a train to Texas, where she was supposed to meet an associate who would take her to Mexico for the final exchange. But when she arrived, the associate never showed. She waited and waited until, finally, she realized she had been played. By the time Evelyn understood what had happened, Means was long gone. He had taken the money and disappeared, leaving her humiliated and empty-handed. And worse, the child was still missing. The real kidnappers were still out there. And the scam had wasted precious time in the real investigation. But Means wasn't as untouchable as he thought. The truth was closing in. The real Lindbergh investigation had never stopped. Law enforcement was working tirelessly to track the kidnappers and recover the child. And as they dug deeper, they began hearing rumors about Gaston Means. It didn't take long before federal agents pieced together his scam. By May 1932, just 2 months after the kidnapping, FBI agents tracked Means down and arrested him. He was charged with fraud and grand larceny. The evidence was overwhelming. They had testimony from Evelyn, bank records showing the ransom withdrawal, and no sign that the money had ever gone to the kidnappers. But even then, Means didn't stop lying. On the witness stand, he spun yet another tale. He claimed that he had genuinely been trying to help but had been tricked by 3 mysterious men who had stolen the money from him before he could deliver it. It was the kind of story he had told his whole life, filled with just enough intrigue to make it sound plausible. But this time, it didn't work. The jury saw through him. On June 17, 1932, he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The judge, disgusted by the audacity of his crime, condemned him for his complete lack of conscience. The press had a field day, calling him America's most shameless con artist. Even in a country full of swindlers, Gaston Means had set a new low. And the most tragic part? None of it had helped the Lindbergh baby. On May 12, just before Means was sentenced, the child's body was found in the woods near the Lindbergh estate. He had been killed the very night he was taken. It was a sobering end to the scam. While Means had been playing games, a real tragedy had been unfolding. And for once, there was no escaping the consequences. But even in prison, Gaston Means wasn't done yet. He had one more trick up his sleeve. And it would be his most outrageous lie of all. Act 5, The Fall of a Master Swindler, expanded narration, 4,000 plus words. By May 1932, Gaston Means had lived a life fueled by deception, fraud, and audacious lies. He had conned the rich, fooled the powerful, and manipulated the very justice system that was supposed to hold men like him accountable. But every great con must eventually come to an end. And for Means, that moment had arrived. In the aftermath of the Lindbergh kidnapping scandal, federal authorities had pieced together enough evidence to prove that Means had stolen $100,000 in ransom money from Evelyn Walsh McLean under false pretenses. With the public demanding justice and the FBI eager to make an example out of him, it was only a matter of time before they caught up to him. And this time, there was no escape. On May 6, 1932, just days before the body of the Lindbergh baby was discovered, federal agents surrounded Means. The arrest was swift, and there was no dramatic chase, just the cold reality that his long run of deception was finally over. For the first time in his life, Means was trapped in a lie he couldn't talk his way out of. His trial was one of the most sensational of its time. Courtrooms were packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and even members of high society who had once been his victims. The prosecution didn't have to work hard, the evidence spoke for itself. There was proof of the money withdrawal, proof that no ransom exchange had ever taken place, and proof that Means had led McLean on a fabricated journey across the country while he pocketed her money. But true to form, Gaston Means refused to go down quietly. When he took the stand, it was as if he were putting on one last performance. He spun an elaborate defense, claiming that the ransom money had been stolen from him by a group of shadowy criminals, that he had truly intended to rescue the Lindbergh baby, and that the entire thing was just a misunderstanding. He even hinted at knowing secrets about the case that he would reveal in due time. But this time, no one believed him. The jury saw through the lies, the judge was unimpressed, and the press tore his story apart. On June 17, 1932, Gaston Means was convicted of grand theft and fraud and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The master manipulator had finally met his match. Inside the walls of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, Means was a shadow of the man he once was. No longer could he charm his way into fortune. No longer could he manipulate the rich and powerful. He was now just another convict, stripped of his influence, his wealth, and his ability to weave the tales that had made him infamous. But that didn't mean he had stopped trying. Even behind bars, Means continued to spin wild conspiracy theories. He told fellow inmates that he still had powerful connections, that one day he would walk free, and that he was the victim of a political plot to silence him. He claimed to have knowledge of secret government dealings, including inside information on the Teapot Dome scandal and even the alleged poisoning of President Warren G. Harding. He started writing a tell-all book, promising to expose the real truth behind Washington's corruption. But the world outside had moved on. The Great Depression had deepened, Franklin D. Roosevelt had taken office, and the nation was more concerned with survival than with the ramblings of a disgraced conman. The name Gaston Means, once whispered in elite circles, was now little more than a curiosity. He was no longer feared. No longer admired. He was forgotten. In 1938, after serving just 6 years of his sentence, Means became gravely ill. Decades of indulgence had caught up to him. He suffered from gallstones, and his health deteriorated rapidly. In his final days, the man who had once lived off lies now had no one left to lie to. On December 12, 1938, Gaston Means died in prison, taking his last, greatest secrets to the grave. But the mystery didn't end there. Even in death, Means left questions unanswered. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to the ransom money he stole from Evelyn Walsh McLean. Some say he hid it before his arrest, burying it in a secret location known only to him. Others believe he funneled it into offshore accounts through unnamed associates. And some suspect that the money never really existed in full, that Means had spent it recklessly the moment he got his hands on it. In the end, Gaston Means was called many things: a genius, a liar, a rogue, a mastermind. But what he really was a man who understood one simple truth: people will always believe what they want to believe. He exploited greed, fear, and desperation, bending the world to his will through words alone. And as long as there are people who are willing to believe a well-told lie, the legacy of men like him will never truly die. Perhaps that is the greatest con of all.